The reason that conventional assets like real estate and like stocks, the reason they can't beat Bitcoin is they can't get away from the risk and the liability of having human beings operating a physical property in the real world, because lightning strikes in the real world and governments act in the real world.
All you're relying on is there not being a 51% attack to reverse your transaction, which is different than credit. So you're sending a largely irreversible bearer asset to someone at roughly the speed of light, especially if you're using something like the Lightning Network. But even if you're using the base layer, it's, half an hour for a reasonably settled transaction.
I mean, there's a time when Bitcoin was growing 200% a year, then 100% a year. And the last 40 months have been 40 to 50% a year. So clearly it's reasonable for Bitcoin growth to be cooling at some point. But the difference between 14% and 7% is the difference between your $1 million becoming $1 billion. At 14%, your $1 million becomes $1 billion of purchasing power, right? And at 7%, your $1 million stays $1 million, right?
Exactly.
Do you want to double 10 times in a row? That's 14 versus 7. Or do you want to basically break even 10 times in a row every decade? So ultimately, you can get excited in the near term about hyper growth Bitcoin, the 40, 50% Bitcoin, that's hyper growth. And I can give you a dozen reasons why it'll continue to grow more than 14%, over the next decade or so. But the reason that thinking out 100 years makes sense is because when you think out 3 generations, it's very clarifying, and it allows you to avoid all the noise and all the confusion and all the sound and fury. And everybody wants to wave smoke and mirrors in front of you and get you to juggle razor blades and shock and awe you in order to get you to give them your money. It's like, for example, if you were the royal family of the UK and I said, oh, there's a pandemic in London, but there's no pandemic in the middle of this island in the Atlantic, so I will trade you 1,000 acres in the mid-Atlantic for the center of London and Buckingham Palace, and Chelsea. Would you trade in a panic? Because if you did, when the pandemic ends, you would realize that you own something worth nothing, and you gave up the middle of London that was worth $100 billion. And so that's why everybody's going to always try to get you to panic. They're always going to basically fudge you. They're going to say, oh, this is not safe. That is not safe. And their goal is to get your Bitcoin from you. They may not even realize they're trying to get their Bitcoin from you, but they want to be relevant, right? What I'm saying is you own the most desirable thing in the universe and you lock it away and you wait for 100 years and your family is rich. And if that's the case, then why would you ever watch their television show? Why would you ever give them your money? Why would you ever pay them a commission? Why would you give them a 2% management fee and a 20% participation? Why would you buy their altcoin? Why would you buy their stock? Why would you hire them to give you advice? Why would you read their writing? Think of it as digital property rather than a digital currency. The use of a currency is as a medium of exchange. And the benefit of a currency is it's a tax-free medium of exchange. So when you make something legal tender in Japan or Russia or China or the US or Europe, it means that you can trade it 100 times a day at high frequency, and all the accounting systems are locked onto that currency, like the euro or the dollar, and there's no taxable event. So companies and governments are always going to want to price things and trade things in the fiat currency as long as there's a government, right? The only time that you're going to use a non-fiat currency for high frequency medium of exchange is when you're in a zone where the currency is literally collapsed. Like if you're in Africa or some war zone and the currency is literally collapsed, there is no government and there is no effective currency, then maybe. But In all the places in the world where the currency, where the government's functional, the currency is functional. So instead of thinking about that Bitcoin replacing that currency, which it distracts you and it causes you to make all these mental mistakes. Like people go, well, it's only valuable to replace the currency, but it's volatile and it's not built in the accounting system and it's taxable. So therefore it's not going to replace the currency. And so therefore I won't buy it. See, that takes you down a rat hole where you kind of tie yourself in knots in a straitjacket and you come to the wrong conclusion. The right way to think about this is Bitcoin is going to replace all the assets that are currency derivatives, and it's going to replace all of the assets that are weaker properties. So for example, I'm still going to use the dollar to pay my employees, but maybe I won't hold sovereign debt or corporate debt on my balance sheet. Maybe I'll replace the debt with Bitcoin, right? Do I want to wait 30 years and get paid 3 or 4% interest for 30 years? Or do I want to own Bitcoin, which is appreciating at 40% a year and in the extreme will appreciate, say, 14% a year, right? Tax-free or tax deferred. So if you think about it, Bitcoin's replacing bonds. It's not replacing the CNY, the euro, or the USD. It's replacing the bonds that are paying coupons in euros or CNY or USD. And then it's replacing value stocks because you bought that value stock, like that utility company, because it pays a dividend, and it pays the dividend in USD or euros or CNY. So if the value of the currency is falling 7% a year, then the value of the discounted cash flows is also falling, right? The discount rate is the 7%. So you got to take the cash flow from the value stock and take the risk-free rate of 7%, tack on a risk premium of 5%, and you have to discount the cash flows of the value stock by 12% a year. So you see, if you think about the math, you realize that the value of the cash flows from the company are falling exponentially, and the higher the inflation rate, the less valuable the cash flows in the future.
Bitcoin kind of solves these last two problems, which is it's the first credible way to send value long distances without relying on credit. You know, all you're relying on is the ongoing functioning of a decentralized network. You know, so all you're relying on is there not being a 51% attack to reverse your transaction, which is different than credit. So you're sending a largely irreversible bearer asset to someone at roughly the speed of light, especially if you're using something like the Lightning Network. But even if you're using the base layer, it's, you know, half an hour for a reasonably settled transaction. And also you have infinite value density. So for example, unlike an airport, with an airport with cash or gold, you know, with Bitcoin, you could memorize 12 words and bring $1 billion through an airport if you had it. Right. There's just infinite value density that can go in and out of countries.
It's so beautiful.
Yeah. It breaks that whole thing wide open. And then secondly, if I want to pay a videographer in Egypt, he can send me a QR code or a string of numbers and I can pay him in whatever he wants. It could be Bitcoin, it could be dollar stable coins, you know, whatever he wants.
With reasonable privacy. Yeah.
Yeah, with reasonable privacy, and it depends, and there's ways to improve that over time. But, you know, he can get some degree of just direct to him that goes around his local banking system. The same thing is true, like if there's a Norwegian graphic designer and she charges whatever she wants. She's okay, I want stable coins, I want Bitcoins. And instead of going through like their local official exchange rate, it can go at the real kind of the street exchange rate. Like it can get directly to her, and then she can either, in some cases, depending on where she is, just spend that directly. She could spend with Bitcoin or spend with stable coins. Or if she does convert to the local currency, she's now basically converting on the street rate, which is better for her to get back into the local currency. And so these kind of 160 different currency bubbles every one of them has their gates down now. They're all starting to get cracked open. And of course, this takes time because only in the past 5 years has any of this been liquid, right? So I mean, stable coins were tiny until this last cycle. Bitcoin was fairly small to the last like 2 cycles. And until it gets kind of bigger, less volatile, just more liquid overall, more awareness, more comfort with how it works, you know, it's kind of limited at the current time. But the more Bitcoin communities pop up, the more people use stablecoins, whatever's working for them, whatever the market forces kind of end up wanting. There's pros and cons to both, obviously. That just starts cracking this like artificial framework we've had for the past, century and a half, really. And I don't think that the market understands that how big that can be yet. Like it can change macro, it can change money. It has huge implications as long as just a couple things are true, as long as the Bitcoin network remains decentralized, secure, and as long as its overall adoption and liquidity keeps improving because it is solving a problem. And if that happens, then that I think just increasingly chips away at these currency bubbles we have.